What we're going to do is kind of do a run-through of looking at the past year, 2017, and we're using as our cutoff point sort of basically President Trump's inauguration. President Trump's election, there's a lot to like about President Trump. There are some things to dislike about President Trump. I think I can say that in as general a way as possible without offending everybody. But one of the things that was... Wow, okay, all right, there we go. But it was very surprising that Trump won to begin with. I think in the lead up to the election, every poll said Hillary was going to win, Hillary was going to win. And President Trump did give the pro-life movement an opportunity, that we now have a president in the White House who is, right now anyway, advocating for our policies. And so we had the opportunity to get a lot of things done as it related to the Supreme Court, as it related to abortion funding, et cetera. So we're going to do a year in review of the past year and looking forward to 2018. And again, this is not a rah-rah, President Trump is awesome rally. This is not a boo-boo, President Trump sucks rally. Basically, I want to do as an objective review, just looking at pro-life policy, what has happened, what needed to have happened, what needs to happen, what's going to happen in the future. And again, feel free to jump in if you have any questions, and at the very end, I'll totally throw it open to Q&A. So let's go to the next slide. Ms. Liz? Okay. So I tried to lay it out, sort of what our priorities were as it relates to pro-life public policy during the past year. So the thing I wanted to start with, when Antonin Scalia passed away in the last year of President Obama's presidency, it was sort of really scary because, as you probably sort of know, the Supreme Court is sort of laid out right now on the abortion question. There were about 4 justices on the Supreme Court who believed that states should be able to regulate abortion as they see fit. So if a state thinks that abortion should only be legal 20 weeks before, in the first 20 weeks of pregnancy, they should be allowed to do that. If a state thinks abortion should only be legal in the first trimester, they should be allowed to do that. If a state believes that abortion should only be legal to save the life of the mother, that should be something that states can do. Right now, with the way the Supreme Court has issued its rulings, states have no liberty to make any kind of reasonable determinations on abortion law whatsoever. They're forced to make abortion effectively legal for all 40 weeks of pregnancy and for any reason. And as a result of Roe v. Wade and then Planned Parenthood versus Casey, America has some of the most deregulated abortion policies in the whole world. Most of Europe bans abortion after 20 weeks of pregnancy. France bans abortion after the first trimester. A lot of places will require you to go through extensive counseling before you can get an abortion, or require genuine medical emergencies or things like that. So America is right there with China, North Korea, Vietnam, as being one of the only countries in the world that allows abortion for any reason and at any point in pregnancy. So the fact that President Trump was elected and was able to replace Antonin Scalia with Neil Gorsuch was a huge deal. Again, we now still have the status quo: 4 people who would let states regulate abortion as they see fit, 4 liberals who want totally unregulated abortion, and then 1 kind of moderate in the middle, Anthony Kennedy, who basically winds up, whatever he wants to do, winds up ruling the day. So the appointment of Neil Gorsuch, this was a really big deal, and Neil Gorsuch, speaking as a lawyer, I've read Neil Gorsuch's book on assisted suicide and euthanasia, and I think we have a real, genuine ally on the Supreme Court now. I'd say he might actually be the most pro-life justice, based on his book on other pro-life questions like assisted suicide and euthanasia. I think he has a better formulated view of human dignity than possibly anyone we've ever had on the Supreme Court, and I think it's a real boon to all of us to have him on the court. In addition to him, there have been lots of other federal judges appointed who've been great, including one of my old law professors at Notre Dame, Amy Barrett, who's on the Seventh Circuit. So any of you guys have any thoughts? Were you listening to any of that, Jonathan? Okay. All right. Okay. So I'll sort of take that one as sort of the lawyer in the room. But anyway, so the next question is Obamacare. So when President Trump was elected, one of the things Republicans had been saying for years, we're going to repeal Obamacare. And as an organization, we at Right to Life, we don't take positions necessarily on healthcare questions like how many people should be covered, should we have universal healthcare coverage, should we do that's kind of beyond our purview. What we do care about is the fact that Obamacare included some really dangerous aspects to it that really promoted abortion. So through Obamacare, there were about $800 billion of federal funding. That's $800 billion, or excuse me, $80 billion. $80 billion. That's billion with a B. It's like 1,000 millions. $80 billion every year would go to subsidize healthcare plans in the Obamacare exchanges that included abortion coverage. So Obamacare was, in many ways, a huge boon to the abortion industry. And one of the chief priorities for pro-lifers coming into this last year was to get that stuff repealed. That has not happened. And based on the way the Senate is shaping up, it doesn't look like it's going to happen. So I don't know if any of you guys have any comments
on Obamacare. Yeah. I would say they're still trying to chip away at it, but at this point, it's going to be very, very tough, just because of the makeup of the Senate and everything right now, legislatively. I do think, though, that some of the ways that President Trump has directed the Health and Human Services Department to repeal some of the requirements on certain types of plans and requiring abortion and contraception and things like that, that's really positive. The danger of that is, and this is something where I think we have to be honest, like you said, John, it's not a bash Trump session, but whenever you hear President Trump or someone else say, oh, and we've repealed Obamacare, no, they've repealed a few key pieces, but the problem is, just like we saw with President Obama, anything that you do by executive order can be undone by executive order. So it's very, very good, like kudos, thumbs up, President Trump and the administration, that the Health and Human Services Department is providing this relief for pro-lifers. However, in 2020 or 2024, there's a very good chance that in one of those 2 years, a Democrat will probably be elected for president. It's just statistically, that's probably going to happen. If you think there's going to be a pro-life Republican in office for the rest of the United States history, no. So that being said, I think that it's important for us to not let up. We have to realize that it is important for us to actually get a statute, a law in place, and not just rely on executive orders and regulations.
And as disappointing as it was to not see it repealed, it was encouraging to see an attempt to go another route to at least defund Planned Parenthood fiscally through the budget. And again, that has not been successful, but it was at least somewhat encouraging to see another method attempting to address that.
Right. And so that leads us into the next point, which is defunding Planned Parenthood. So Planned Parenthood every year receives over $400 million in federal funding, and most of that is in the form of Medicaid reimbursements for their non-abortion services. Now, some of you may think, well, it's for non-abortion services. What's wrong with that? Money is fungible. Okay, if I give you $400 million to do one thing, it frees up a lot of cash to do other stuff. Basically, what we're doing is the federal government is bankrolling all of Planned Parenthood's less profitable activities, which allows them to allocate more resources, more time, more staff, etc., to the thing that is their biggest driver, the service they do that is their single biggest driver of revenue, which is abortion. Okay, obviously, abortion is a more expensive procedure. You can bill for more. You can bill more for it to insurance and to Medi-Cal in our state than you can for condoms or a pap smear or pregnancy tests or things like that. So, unfortunately, we tried on a number of occasions to defund Planned Parenthood. And right now, the makeup of the Senate, I mean, people might say, well, there's a Republican majority in the Senate. Why can't we defund Planned Parenthood? There may be, again, Right to Life is not a Republican organization. There's a Republican majority in the Senate. There's not a pro-life majority in the Senate. So right now, there are actually, back at the start of the Trump administration, there were only 50 senators that I would describe as pro-life. Now, after the elections that we had in Alabama a few months ago, where a Democrat won a really, for a long time, safely Republican, safely pro-life seat, there are now only 49 pro-life senators in the U.S. Senate. So it's really difficult to pass legislation. The framers of the Constitution made it difficult because they didn't want things to pass that didn't have some national consensus. So right now, until the 2018 elections, there's not much of a chance at Planned Parenthood being defunded. There may be now. Planned Parenthood has been defunded in certain other more limited ways. States now have the ability to cut off funding to Planned Parenthood through their Title X programs, which are sort of state-based healthcare programs. So some aspects of that have been successful, but for the most part, the attempt to defund Planned Parenthood has been a failure. The next thing we want to talk about is the pain-capable abortion ban. This is a bill that would prohibit abortions after a child can begin to experience pain, after the child's nervous system is developed enough that many scientific studies and analysis have concluded the child can feel pain. And that point is roughly 20 weeks following conception. It's not a coincidence that in most of Europe, abortion is illegal after the 20-week point. It's about the halfway point of pregnancy. This passed the House of Representatives, but it failed in the Senate. In the Senate, so the Senate is characterized by debate can theoretically go on forever in the Senate. You need to get 60 votes to get people to shut up and actually vote on something. So effectively, to pass a law in the Senate, you need 60 votes. And as I said, we don't have 60 votes. Now, because this bill is dealing with late-term abortions, so we're not talking about a zygote, a single cell. We're talking about a baby that has arms and legs and fingers and toes and a heartbeat and brain activity, and babies that are fighting for their lives right now in the Valley Children's NICU outside the womb, but inside the womb have no legal protection against being in a D&C abortion, literally being torn limb from limb. This bill passed, as I said, this bill passed the House. It only got 53 or 54 votes, I believe, in the Senate.
Which I will say again, because I want to give credit where credit's due, in the case of not wanting to be partisan, this is one of those rare cases of a pro-life bill where you did have pro-choice Republicans, Lisa Murkowski from Alaska and Susan Collins from Maine, voted against the bill, but Joe Manchin, who is a Democratic senator from West Virginia who claims to be pro-life, voted for the bill. So, I mean, this is a bipartisan issue in support, and we would love to see that. We'd love to see more pro-choice Democrats coming alongside some of these bills. But again, there's enough to pass it, but there's not enough to end debate, which is just ridiculous.
Okay. So that's the Democratic senator from Indiana voted for it. So that was kind of encouraging. And hopefully some of the senators who voted against it will have their feet held to the fire in 2018 when they're up for re-election. The next checkpoint on there is the cutting off of abortion funding via executive order. So this is one thing. This is, I would say, a real accomplishment by the Trump administration. Basically, there are certain ways in which the federal government can or cannot. Certain ways in which the federal government can fund abortion, which during Republican presidencies, they don't fund it, and in Democratic presidencies, they do fund it. And usually what happens is the day after a Republican president takes office, they immediately issue an executive order to cut off that funding, and the day a Democratic president takes office, they immediately issue an executive order to restore that funding. So this was happening in a number of areas. One of them was through it's called the Mexico City policy. So President Trump restored the Mexico City policy, which was in place under President George W. Bush and under the first President Bush, and which President Clinton and President Obama had gotten rid of during their presidencies. Basically, the Mexico City policy says that foreign non-governmental organizations, so these are sort of foreign entities that provide charitable work in other countries, cannot receive federal dollars to provide abortions. So International Planned Parenthood is the chief recipient we're talking about. So by this executive decision by the president, millions and millions of taxpayer dollars are no longer going to providing abortions in third world countries, in Africa, and in other parts of the world. President Trump has also cut off a lot of funding to the United Nations. What is it? What's the name of it? Yeah, the United Nations Population Fund, which provided abortion services. So a lot of very good things happened. Again, it's just this on-off switch. When you have a Republican president, they cut off this funding. When you have a Democrat in office, they restore that funding. So those are some good things. But as I said, this is not a pro-Trump, anti-Trump rally. We're going to be objective here. Cutting off stem cell funding. This was a failure. Yes. Sure. Yeah. So basically the question is, if other countries are more restrictive of abortion, how is it that we were funding foreign organizations in other countries to perform abortions? I think in some cases, most other countries have legalized abortion in some form. So most countries do allow abortion in the first trimester, for example. So I think a lot of our dollars to these foreign entities were going to those kinds of abortions that are legal in those countries. I think in some cases there were these really cruel things where the Obama administration was saying, we'll give your poor, starving African country, these kinds of federal aid, which you desperately need, but only if you change some of your policies as it relates to abortion, only if you also take some of this funding as it relates to abortion. So a lot of that was pretty cruel and was going on.
It was really almost blackmail. And there's this really great African pro-life advocate, and I'm going to butcher her name, so I'll try to post it on the Right to Life Facebook page later, but I think it's Obianaja Wajaku. I don't know if any of you have seen her. She's a really awesome on social media, but she's done some phenomenal interviews on this, and what she calls it is basically reproductive colonialism. And she says you hear a lot of people in the media today and on the left that say, oh, colonialism was the worst thing that ever happened. We were completely violating the rights and inherent freedom of, African and Asian countries. And yet, they're totally willing to do that when it comes to abortion. They're willing to come and say, yeah, you know what? I'd be happy to give you this medical aid to help keep your children alive, but you got to let us come in and start providing abortions. You got to let us come in and start doing sterilizations and distributing contraception to your entire population. You got to change these restrictive laws if you want some of our Western money. I mean, it really is offensive, and it's something that I think it's, like you said, John, it's good that they have done, they've reeled back some of it.
Okay, the next point to talk about is embryo-destructive stem cell research. So embryo-destructive stem cell research first kind of came to the forefront in American public policy during the Bush administration, and President Bush instituted a policy basically that the federal government was no longer going to pay for the creation of new stem cell lines. This involves taking a human embryo, killing it, extracting stem cells from it, and developing those stem cell lines and making scientific discoveries from it. Those policies were rescinded under the Obama administration. The Obama administration was like, nope, we can create new stem cell lines, all this stuff. And the vision for some of the people who are supportive of embryo-destructive stem cell research, which again is not the only kind of stem cell research. I shouldn't say again because I didn't say it the first time, but anyway. There are other kinds of stem cell research using stem cells, which are these very potent cells that are growing at a very rapid rate and can be used in a lot of medical advances. You can get stem cells from adults and extract them in a way that doesn't kill you. You can get it from umbilical cords. You can get stem cells from other sources other than unborn fetuses whom you have to kill in order to extract them. And there have been a lot of great medical advances from those kinds of non-lethally extracted stem cells. However, the Obama administration changed the policies that existed under the Bush administration, got rid of the President's Commission on Bioethics, and gave full federal funding, full support for stem cell research that involved creating stem cells purely to destroy them. The official who is directly responsible for this within the Trump administration was Dr. Francis Collins, who was the head of the National Institutes of Health. And I think the biggest pro-life screw-up of the Trump administration was leaving this man, Dr. Collins, in his position as the director of the NIH. So a lot of the changes that need to happen at the NIH are not going to happen because this guy is still in his job. And this, in spite of the fact that a number of pro-life congressmen wrote to President Trump explicitly asking him to remove this guy from office, and I'm not sure why, but President Trump did not act on that. So that was a real slip and a miss. I know there are pro-lifers in Congress who are still working on this question. This guy serves at the president's pleasure, so the president could remove him anytime he wants to, and I hope he does. We talked a little bit about the HHS mandate repeal, and this was a really positive thing. Sorry, I should have asked anyone else have anything on stem cells?
Actually, really quickly. So really quickly, just to reiterate, having this is completely irrelevant. They have the ability to actually 3D print identical cells to embryonic stem cells. So the fact that this is going on is completely unnecessary. And it's kind of gone on under the radar. It's not as talked about in the pro-life movement itself, and it is an area that we do need to emphasize more and have more of a focus on it, because the science is there to completely replace this, and the fact that we haven't makes no sense at all.
And especially as it relates to human cloning, because that's what the vision of some of these people who continue to support embryo-destructive stem cell research is, we are going to create human beings solely to extract their stem cells. And the numbers, it's almost like dystopian, like something out of like the scenes in the Matrix where you see like how they're harvesting human beings. Was that in like the cruddy Matrix movies? Oh, that was in the first one? Okay. I thought it might have been from the second and third Matrix movies, which I'm the only person who likes those movies. But basically, the idea of creating up to millions of human beings just to destroy them, like it's mind-bogglingly perverse and evil. So the Trump administration needs to smarten up on this. The next question, we talked a little bit about the HHS mandate. The HHS mandate was basically instituted during the Obama administration, and it required that business owners who provide health insurance plans for their employees had to include coverage of certain kinds of things. Some of those things included so-called contraceptives, which are actually abortifacient. They don't function to prevent pregnancy. They function to make it so that a living human being is either flushed out of the system or dies in an early miscarriage or something like that. Now, this mandate has been fought by two different kinds of entities. Private corporations who are led by pro-life owners who don't want to provide this for their employees, and nonprofit organizations, many of which have a religious affiliation, who have religious objections. The Supreme Court heard the case of for-profit corporations who are owned by pro-life owners in the Hobby Lobby decision. Some of you may have heard that. So Hobby Lobby is the big corporation that has, all their hobby stores all over the country. It's an organization that's just owned by one family, and it's a very pro-life Christian family. They took it all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said, no, it's infringing upon their First Amendment rights to free exercise of religion. Again, it's that word, exercise of religion, as opposed to freedom of worship, to force them to provide these forms of contraception that go so explicitly against their deeply and sincerely held religious beliefs. The lawsuit didn't quite make it all the way to the Supreme Court as it relates to nonprofit organizations, and particularly religious nonprofits. So when President Trump came into office, he repealed those mandates as they relate to religious nonprofits, groups like orders of nuns. Now, can you imagine anyone who needs contraception less than an order of nuns? But beyond orders of nuns, it was literally everybody. It included like my own alma mater, the University of Notre Dame, was being forced to do that. Catholic dioceses were being forced to do that. Individual churches, everybody was being forced to provide these things. The Trump administration has reversed these policies. They're being challenged. That reversal of policy is being challenged in court right now. And again, this is part of the idea that abortion must be safe, legal, and accessible. That if you're denying me the ability to access abortion by not requiring my employer to pay for it, you're infringing on my right to abortion access, which, again, is kind of crazy. So,
something that was a success as far as the HHS is they now do fully acknowledge and protect human life from conception. They actually take a stance on that now. So I just wanted to add to that there are advancements in this area.
And I would say regarding the conscience protection, again, it's something that's it's good and bad, but it's just kind of maddening to think that what President Obama was able to do in some cases by executive order through the executive agencies, directing the HHS to impose this mandate. It's fine when President Obama does it, and then when he gets slapped down in court, okay. But then for some reason when President Trump says, this is something that was instituted by executive order, I'm going to roll this back. It's within my authority. No, sorry. You can't do the exact same thing that President Obama did that was already struck down by court. It's just the other side is relentless, even on issues like this where there's no question. I mean, there's no question that this is legally within his power to do and repeal, at least from a executive order side of things. But this is one reason why we can't ever give up. We can't rest on our laurels. And I know we're at the end, so I'll say one thing on that. On all of these issues, even though there's some wins and some losses, we cannot ever rest on our laurels because sometimes I think that pro-life people can think, oh, well, that bad pro-abortion guy Obama isn't in office anymore. We can just sit back and wait, and maybe we'll vote again in 2020, but until then, we did our job. That is obviously not the case because part of the reason why the done ones are on here is because pro-lifers rallied and pushed hard to make sure they got accomplished. And I guarantee you that if we keep pushing, we might be able to flip some of those fails to successes. If we don't, it's going to be bad.
So get out and vote in 2018. Anyway, the last thing, we have one more slide. I'm going to run through the second slide really quick, but keep it right here, Liz. No, go back, Liz. There you go. Okay. So the Conscience Protection Act. So things to watch in 2018. One of the first things I wanted to mention is the Conscience Protection Act because it directly relates to us in California. So in 2014, the California Department of Managed Healthcare issued a regulation. So not a law passed by the legislature, just a bunch of bureaucrats in Sacramento issued a regulation. California law requires that health insurance plans cover essential services. Any healthcare plan sold in the state has to cover essential services. What are essential services? That gets defined by the California Department of Managed Healthcare. In August 2014, they changed their definition to include elective surgical abortions. That meant that overnight, every single health insurance plan in the state of California has to cover elective surgical abortions. That is crazy. Okay, the idea that was just done without any debate, without passing a law, nothing, it's completely absurd. So this church that we're in, if they have employees, if they have an employer-based healthcare plan, this church is paying for abortion coverage. Every single employer in this state is paying for abortion coverage for their employees. So the Conscience Protection Act is a bill that's been introduced in the U.S. Congress, and basically it would prevent states from doing this. It would provide an enforcement mechanism so that we could sue the state of California and say, you have to stop doing this. So it's something that needs to get done. I think it's going to be part of an appropriations bill at some point, so there's a likelihood it could pass during 2018. Any thoughts on that, you guys? Okay, yeah. The next one is NIFLA versus Becerra. So Jonathan talked about this. This relates to that California law that requires pro-life pregnancy resource centers, clinics, to post a notice letting people know where they can go to get abortions. As I was talking about, the First Amendment protects your right to speak on questions of social, cultural, religious importance. And there are two sides to the First Amendment. The government's not allowed to censor you on those topics, but the government also is not allowed to force you to say things on those topics that you don't believe in. So this case has reached all the way up to the Supreme Court. I'm really hopeful the Supreme Court will strike this law down. So,
you want to go first?
Oh, well, just as a note, and this could, if it does fail, if we do lose this, it could go beyond just pregnancy resource centers. This could apply to any nonprofit on any issue that they consider needing to provide an alternative option to what you are offering. So Catholic hospitals, nonprofit organizations, you name it. So this is really a big issue, not just for the pro-life movement, but we should be getting a lot of support from other organizations, other areas on this matter.
They should, yeah. This is something I'm very passionate about this case because, again, I was in the hearing room in 2015 when this law was passed. I have a long-standing relationship with pregnancy care centers. I'm an Eagle Scout. I did my Eagle Scout project for a pregnancy care center when I lived in Sacramento. And I was, yeah, exactly. I'm going to be in Washington, D.C. on the steps of the Supreme Court for these oral arguments next month. It's going to be on March 20th. And I will just say, as a little plug for California Family Council, we're going to be doing some Facebook Live videos that day from the steps of the Supreme Court. We will also be encouraging people, if you sign up on our email list or if you go on our Facebook page, we're going to be posting some resources in the next about 2 weeks that you'll be able to download and share with either your church or with your pro-life club or your student group or your homeschool group or whatever, to encourage people to, number one, pray on Sunday the 18th. We're going to ask the churches that are involved with us to lead their congregations in prayer on that day. And then also, if you would, I promise it won't actually take that much of a sacrifice, but if you would consider, if you're not already doing some sort of fast for Lent or something like that, if you maybe would consider fasting the morning of the 20th. You don't even have to fast very long because the oral arguments will be over by about noon our time. It'll be very easy. But if you just consider maybe fasting breakfast and maybe lunch on Tuesday the 20th, this issue, I mean, when you think about this should be such an open and shut case. You have the government that is telling private individuals you have to speak a message, and writing on your wall is speech. You have to speak a message that you fundamentally disagree with. So set aside the spiritual aspect of this. When I was with Alliance Defending Freedom 2 weeks ago doing a training on this, they had a very secular example. How many of you guys are familiar with the American Lung Association? Just sort of vaguely, you've maybe seen commercials. So they're an organization that is basically founded to help fight lung cancer. One of the ways they do that is they have all these anti-smoking campaigns. What if when you went into the American Lung Association's office, there was a sign that said, here's the nearest location where you can go and buy cigarettes? Just in case. We're not saying you have to buy them, but in case you're curious, here's where you can go get free government-sponsored cigarettes. It's obscene. It'd be ridiculous. And everyone would say, no, I have the freedom of speech. I also have the freedom of association, freedom of assembly, and you can't force me to say something that is directly in opposition to the entire purpose why we were founded. And beyond that, you set the spiritual angle of it aside. The fact that this isn't only applying, this law didn't just apply to medical clinics. This also applied to faith-based institutions, and it required them to also speak a message. What's next? I mean, if you go to a Catholic church, are you going to be said, well, we appreciate you coming, and visiting Holy Spirit today, but just in case you'd like to try a different theological perspective, here's the 5 closest Protestant churches. Or you're at New Covenant. Hey, here's the nearest Muslim spiritual center, Muslim mosque, or Jewish synagogue. I'm sorry, you don't have to say that those other institutions are bad to say I shouldn't be required to promote something that violates my faith. And this is why this is going to be such a key issue. So, yeah, make sure you follow. I know you're going to be posting a bunch on it as well, but this is a huge issue. It's coming up in just 3 weeks, so please keep your eyes open about it.
So, yeah, that's NIFLA versus Sarah. We're going to run through the last things real quickly just so we have some – I know we're a little over, so we'll have some time for Q&A. SB 320 we already talked about. It's really bad. Get in touch with your state assembly member. Right to Life has a blog post about SB 320 up on our website. It has a link to – you can find out who your state assembly member is. Just type in your address, and it takes you right to his a contact page for him. So contact your assembly member. Ask them to oppose SB 320. Our public university health centers should not be providing abortions. I think we already talked about why defunding Planned Parenthood and Obamacare reform is so difficult. Again, we only have 49 pro-life senators. And that leads us to the 2018 elections. The 2018 elections could have really big implications for these last 2 years of President Trump's term. Right now, there's a significant pro-life majority in the House of Representatives. Every member of the House is up for re-election in 2018. There are 49 pro-life senators, and a third of the U.S. Senate is up for re-election. Now, in the Senate, there's a very good chance of seeing some real pro-life gains. 33 senators are up for re-election, and I think like 23 of them or something are Democrats, and almost all of them are pro-choice. And a lot of them are actually in states that President Trump won in 2016. So there's a very good chance that the pro-life cause could pick up some votes in the Senate in 2018. There's also, though, a very good chance we could lose the House of Representatives in 2018. So if we want to see real progress being made, if we want to see the pro-choice aspects of Obamacare repealed, if we want to see Planned Parenthood defunded, the pro-life majority needs to retain its majority in the House, and it needs to make advances in the Senate. So that's what to look forward to as it relates to these issues. So that's it for our panel discussion. And I'll open up the floor to any questions if anyone has anything. Yes, Pastor.
Last year, I talked to the head of the Black Chamber of Commerce in Fresno, and the leader is Tara Lynn Gray. And one of the things that she said when I talked to her about defunding Planned Parenthood was, what are poor minority women to do if Planned Parenthood goes away? Can you address that issue?
Yeah, so I'll let one of you guys answer it if you want. I think we all kind of know the answer to it. So, if you want.
Well, there are thousands of federally qualified healthcare facilities out there. They outnumber Planned Parenthood. I don't know what the number is.
Almost 4 to 1.
4 to 1, yeah. So there are so many other options that can do more than what Planned Parenthood does. They also do dental. They do everything that Planned Parenthood has to refer out for anyways. So there are far more options for women. Planned Parenthood is virtually irrelevant in any other service beyond abortion. So these federally qualified healthcare facilities would offer all of those services without abortion. So there's a real replacement for Planned Parenthood, and if we even just redirected dollars towards that, it would be filling in that gap very quickly.
The other thing that I think is important when we talk about that, the people who are being insensitive and who are not caring about low-income individuals, it's not conservatives who want to defund Planned Parenthood, it's Planned Parenthood. They're saying that we would rather women and children not get care than us give up abortion. They're putting abortion ahead of every other service that they supposedly do. They're saying this is the one irrevocable, inviolable service that we do, and if you touch this, we're going to close our doors and we refuse to serve any other patients. So I always get a little bit annoyed, and not obviously I think at the members of the Black Chamber, but the media continually pushes this, that if we defund Planned Parenthood, all these people are going to be out of services. There's a very simple answer to that. Just stop doing abortions. I mean, even during the campaign, much to the consternation of some conservatives, President Trump said, look, Planned Parenthood does some good things. Maybe if they just stopped doing abortions, we wouldn't have to defund them. And, of course, Planned Parenthood immediately rejected that. Ivanka Trump, who is not really with us on the pro-life issue, she even tried to come up with a solution. She said, look, what if you guys spin off what you do as abortion and you start a new separate organization? So you have Planned Parenthood as it exists that does all the other good services, and then you have this other organization that just does the abortions. Planned Parenthood refused. They've been offered a solution, and they are the ones that are standing in the way of this, not conservatives, not pro-lifers.
Plus, I'll also note all of the proposals that would take funding away from Planned Parenthood, really it would just redirect funding. So all of the dollars that Planned Parenthood receives would instead go to other federally qualified health centers that basically they do all of Planned Parenthood services. They just don't do abortions. So any other questions?
I said it was 4-1 for federally qualified health centers. It's actually 20.
Okay, yeah. And I know in like Fresno County, there are at least like 15 federally qualified health centers, some of them in rural areas, a few in Fresno, that provide those services also. So, yes, sir.
It's really more of a curiosity question. You used a term, second wave feminism. Could you explain that?
Yes, the waves of feminism. Yeah, I've actually been sort of curious about how those waves are defined. So anyway, take it away, Anna.
So I opened a can of worms with that. If you're looking at feminism, there's generally it's split into two waves ultimately, and it kind of correlates to the time and the issues addressed. So you have your first wave feminists, Susan B. Anthony, the suffragettes, all of that back when they were around. More recently, and I'm not a professional on feminism, so bear with me, but more recently there's been this new rise of feminism. It's called second wave feminism, and its core issues are really reproductive justice is what its focus is. And two men actually monopolized on the movement and created this connection between second wave feminism and the abortion industry. So, and it's really modern feminism as you see it. And that's what second wave feminism refers to.
All right. Anyone else? Yeah.
I also have a question for Anna. Some advocates of pro-choice say that it is anti-feminist to take away a woman's right to choose. How would you respond to them?
Good question. So this is actually a really common one. But as we heard earlier, this isn't, a woman's issue. This isn't even just a health issue. This isn't a, left or right issue. This is a human rights issue. We're talking about living, growing human beings, their right to life, their right to equality. It's a civil rights issue. So that's typically how I respond to it, and you can get all into depth about, these are living human beings. They philosophically deserve equal rights, and you can get into all of that. But just as a brief answer, this is not a women's or a feminist issue. It's a human rights issue.
Really, that question really kind of, it assumes the conclusion it's drawing, okay? So it's you're infringing on women's rights, assumes the lack of humanity of the unborn child. It assumes that there's only one person whose interests are involved in the question. So it's kind of assuming, that's called begging the question. So it's sort of assuming the very conclusion that it's arguing for. If you're just assuming that the unborn child isn't alive, isn't human, that his interests aren't. If this was a question of whether women are allowed to get their appendixes removed, then yeah, this is blatantly anti-feminist. You're telling women that they can't get their appendixes removed. What a jerk. But that's not necessarily the question. You have to sort of, that's ignoring the key thing, which is this a living human being who's a rights-bearing member of our community? And are we now excluding him from the circle of humanity in the same way that we did, for example, with slaves in the pre-Civil War era, the same way that Nazis did with Jews. Not to, the reductio ad Hitler. Any time you bring up Nazis, you've immediately gotten too extreme. But you get what I'm saying. That basically you can't just to say flat out this is a women's issue is ignoring the other side. So.
And just to add to that, on that note, I mean, you'll often hear like this is not a man's issue, and I want to encourage you that we need young men and young women involved in this. It's not just a woman's issue. Don't let them silence you, because they will try to say this is a woman's issue. You have no voice in this. So I just want to encourage that, you have every right to participate in this conversation. And in fact, we need your voice on behalf of the preborn.
And again, if you go back and you look at other civil rights issues, it was very true. You hear sometimes today things argued like, well, if you're against abortion, don't have one. Don't want an abortion, don't have one. That would be like going back to the 1860s and saying, look, if you're against slavery, just don't own slaves. Come on, why do you have to infringe on my rights? Well, I'm sorry, we're talking about a third party's rights here. We're talking about an individual, distinct human being, and we're not. The issue is not primarily your rights if we're going to be outlawing slavery. And I'm not making a preference claim saying, well, I just don't like slavery or I don't like abortion. No, I'm saying slavery and abortion are morally wrong. They should not be tolerated or legal in a just society.
Okay, any other? Oh. Yeah, I've heard those promises.
You mentioned about the failure of the present administration to overturn Obamacare. And I believe, and I want your honest opinion, you, John, and Anna, that if the Republicans would have come up with a viable plan that included the other side, do you think that if they work together that Obamacare can be overturned? Because the exclusiveness of just one party trying to, bring up something in order to overturn it just doesn't seem to work.
That's actually a really interesting question. My perspective, I would say, unfortunately, no. I don't know that it's actually possible, and the reason may actually be abortion. I think, again, you have the head of the Democratic National Committee. The Democrats have changed on abortion in the last 10 years. It was a thing where most Democrats were pro-choice, but they allowed some pro-life Democrats, and they had some more moderate positions on things like abortion funding and things like that. It's not that way anymore. There may be like one or two pro-life Democrats in the Senate, but that's it. And if Republicans are going to hold the line that we should not be subsidizing health care plans that cover abortion, we shouldn't be defunding Planned Parenthood, I just can't see how a compromise is going to be reached that both sides of the aisle are going to join in on. So I wish it could be the case, but I think you're more likely to see a bill that keeps all of Obamacare's abortion funding and reforms Obamacare in some way than you are to see an actually really good bill passed. And or I think most likely is that nothing's going to happen.
I was just going to say that the Democrat Party has even moved far left on abortion since Obamacare. A lot of people don't realize this, but back in 2010, the only reason why Obamacare passed was because there was a group of pro-life Democrats who were in office in the time in the Congress, in the House, pro-life Democrats in the House of Representatives, led by a gentleman named Bart Stupak out of Michigan. And they basically held President Obama's feet to the fire, and they said, we will not vote for this unless you give us a promise, unless you sign an executive order mandating that no federal money is going to directly go to fund plans that go for abortion. That was 2010. 6 years later, when Hillary Clinton ran for office, she ran openly on repealing the Hyde Amendment, which federally for the last 40 years had said no taxpayer funding for abortion. She basically said, no, we need to end Hyde. We need to directly start funding abortion at the federal level. That's what the Democratic Party did in 6 years. So it's not that they've just been kind of slowly drifting, even just since the 90s with President Clinton, 26 years ago, 25 years ago when he came into office. It has been a really rapid evolution to say we're not even going to make pretenses anymore. We're openly going to say you have to fund this, and if you don't, we're going to scream and yell and primary you. So it's something where honestly it's going to take this next generation of young people trying to come back to a position of saying the older, angry, hard abortion choice voices are going to have to go away before we can actually get to, I think, a reasonable position on this.
Okay, I know we're way over, so we'll be available and milling around if any of you have any questions, and especially any of you students, if you continue to have questions or stuff, I'll be available and be hanging out to talk with you.